The papacy. It's such a significant institution, especially, the Protestant view, with those historical claims to supremacy over the Western Church.
Big claims.
Right. But then you look around today, secularism, moral debates, so many different churches saying they have the truth.
Yeah.
It really makes you ask, what's the actual history, and, is it still relevant?
Exactly. And those are the big questions we're tackling in this deep dive. We're really going into the history of this powerful entity. We're using the source you gave us, a brief history of papacy.
Good stuff.
Yeah. And our goal really is to get past just the dates and names. We want to unpack the key shifts, understand the forces behind them, and figure out what's important to grasp about the papacy's whole journey.
Precisely. So whether you're deep into church history or this is all new, we want to make it clear, make it engaging. We'll pull out the crucial moments, the key insights, without getting bogged down.
It's good.
Okay, so let's start right at the beginning. The earliest days. What do we actually know?
Well, the source makes it pretty clear the beginnings are, let's say, more of a puzzle than a straight line. The early Roman Church. There's no solid evidence of a bishop there right away, not until after Jewish converts showed up under Emperor Claudius.
Huh. So that popular idea, the unbroken line of popes, right back to Peter from day one, that's maybe not quite how it happened.
Not based on the historical record we have, no.
Yeah.
Rome's early importance seems to come more from, oral tradition and this huge respect for Peter. He was definitely a key leader in Jerusalem, and yes, he was martyred in Rome.
Okay.
But him being the sole bishop in the way we think of it later, that's not clearly documented early on.
But that link, Peter and the Roman Church, it must have become important somehow, right?
Oh, absolutely. Fast forward to the 2nd century, the early church is dealing with all sorts of new movements like Gnosticism.
Right, the secret knowledge stuff.
Exactly. So in that context, being linked to Peter, a direct apostle, that became a powerful way for the Roman Church to say, hey, we have the authentic tradition.
Okay, so it's about authority.
Pretty much. And this idea, this Petrine succession, Peter's authority being passed down, it got developed even more when other movements popped up, like Montanism, which was, more about prophecy and strict living. Claiming succession from Peter was a way to push back and establish some doctrinal stability.
Right, right. Okay, so how did this claim, being Peter's successor, actually turn into, real clout, real influence?
Well, it wasn't overnight. It was a gradual climb. By the 3rd century, Rome's influence is definitely growing. It starts to kind of overshadow other big early Christian centers.
Like Alexandria or Antioch.
Exactly. And the bishops of these so-called apostolic sees churches, supposedly founded by apostles, they start claiming the special prerogative of judgment. Basically, their opinion mattered more.
Okay.
But, and this is crucial, the Eastern Church, centered around places like Constantinople later on, they really pushed back against this idea of Rome having the final say. They resisted the centralizing trend.
So that East-West tension, it was baked in pretty early on.
You could say that, yeah. And if you look even earlier at the New Testament itself, say 80, 60 to 90, the letters from Paul and others, they show a church structure that was, pretty local, pretty decentralized at first. Paul obviously planted a major church in Rome, which gave it prestige, sure, but authority seemed more spread out among different leaders and congregations.
Okay, let's jump forward then, quite a bit. How do we get from that decentralized picture to the Pope being this, major political player in Europe?
Yeah, that's a big leap. And interestingly, the source points out that the very early popes weren't really chasing worldly power, temporal power.
They were focused spiritually.
Primarily, yes. It wasn't really until the 9th century, the source mentions Pope Leo III and his connection with Charlemagne, that you see a real significant move where the papacy starts kind of encroaching on civil government. And that wasn't always welcomed by rulers either.
But then, the 13th century, that seemed to be the absolute peak of papal power. What happened?
The 13th century, yeah, especially under Pope Innocent III, that's widely seen as the zenith. He basically claimed to be the universal monarch of the world.
Wow. Universal monarch.
Yep. And this was heavily influenced by the rise of scholastic philosophy. Think Thomas Aquinas.
Right, synthesizing faith and reason.
Exactly. Scholasticism provided this sort of intellectual framework that justified the Pope having such a massive authority. Plus, the church controlled the universities, Paris, Bologna, Oxford, so it dominated learning and intellectual life.
Okay, universal monarch sounds grand, but what did it mean, on the ground? practically.
It meant real political muscle. The papacy had a huge say in who ruled the kingdoms of Christendom. The Roman Curia, the papal court, often dealt directly with kings, sometimes even ignoring their own ambassadors. And crucially, the papacy levied taxes on nations, on kings, money flowing straight to the Vatican.
That's incredible power. But the source mentions John Wycliffe being expelled. Why was that such a big deal?
Wycliffe. He was this brilliant English theologian and reformer. He directly challenged the Pope's political power, questioning his authority in worldly matters. That was really the first major intellectual blow against that immense political control the papacy had built up in Western Europe.
Okay, so Wycliffe plants a seed of doubt. And from that peak in the 13th century, it sounds like the political power started to slide downhill.
It did, yeah. The period after saw a pretty significant decline. And it was made much worse by that really damaging situation where you had multiple guys all claiming to be the Pope at the same time, the Great Schism.
Right, I've heard of that. Must have been confusing.
Hugely confusing. And it massively damaged the papacy's prestige and authority. Secular rulers saw this weakness and naturally started asserting their own independence much more forcefully. They could dictate terms more easily.
So the internal fighting weakened their external standing. Makes sense.
Totally. And you combine that internal chaos with specific laws passed by countries, like the Pragmatic Sanction of Bourges in France, or similar laws in England, Provisors, Prémunire, Mortmain.
What do those laws do?
They basically limited the Pope's power to appoint church officials in those countries and controlled the flow of church money. It put church affairs much more under royal control. All these things together really paved the way for the Reformation when the papacy lost huge chunks of Europe. And then later, the French Revolution brought a whole new set of challenges.
Let's circle back for a second to the theological basis. We mentioned Peter as the rock. What were the other key arguments supporting the Pope's role?
Well, that interpretation of Matthew's gospel, "You are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church," that's absolutely central.
The foundation stone idea.
Exactly. The idea was that Peter was the foundation, and this unique authority was passed down through his successors, the bishops of Rome. This whole concept of apostolic succession was vital, the belief that bishops today are in a direct line from the original apostles.
So it really hangs on interpreting that figure.
To a very large degree, yes. And over time, theologians wrote more and more about the special position of the Roman pontiff. They even debated what would happen if a pope fell into heresy, which kind of underlined the perceived need for one clear, authoritative voice to keep doctrine pure.
It's hard to picture the papacy back under the Roman Empire before Constantine converted. Must have been a totally different world.
Oh, completely different. For us today, used to a papacy without its own kingdom, understanding how it worked within the Roman Empire, it requires a real mental shift. The politics, the society, the religious mix, radically different from the Middle Ages or the Renaissance.
But even back then, popes were clearly shaping Christian belief, weren't they?
Absolutely. Early popes like Leo the Great, Gregory the Great, they made massive theological contributions. They defended core Christian doctrines against paganism and various early heresies.
Like Arianism.
For example, their writings were crucial in shaping things like the Nicene Creed, defining who Christ was, and also in helping solidify which books belonged in the New Testament canon. They also wrote apologies, defending Christianity to emperors and intellectuals.
And big events like the fall of the Western Roman Empire or the Council of Chalcedon. How do they affect the papacy?
Hugely important moments. When the Western Empire collapsed, it left a massive power vacuum in Western Europe. The Church, and particularly the Bishop of Rome, kind of stepped into that gap, providing some stability and leadership.
Right.
And the Council of Chalcedon, even though it caused some friction with the East about Rome's exact level of authority, it definitely helped cement the Pope's role as the leading figure in the Western Church.
Okay, so by the time we hit the Middle Ages, the papacy has really evolved. It's a major force spiritually, politically, intellectual.
Precisely. Like we said, that moral and intellectual authority grew right alongside the political power, hitting that peak around the 13th century.
And then Wycliffe pops up again. His challenge wasn't just politics this time, was it?
No. Wycliffe's critique cut deeper. He questioned the very basis of the Church's authority, including its sway over kings and princes. And this was happening around the same time as that disastrous schism, with 3 rival popes running around. That just hammered the papacy's credibility.
It sounds like the European kings and princes were pretty quick to take advantage of the Church's problems.
Oh, absolutely. They were busy building up their own power, consolidating their kingdoms. They saw the papacy was weakened and became much more assertive about their own independence.
Like Gallicanism in France.
Exactly. Gallicanism was all about asserting the French church's autonomy from Rome, and those English laws we mentioned earlier did the same thing, limiting papal power over appointments and money. It was a definite trend.
Was anyone inside the church trying to fix things, to reform, amidst all this power struggle?
Yes, there was always this tension. You had figures who wanted to push papal power even further, but also those who saw the abuses and corruption and genuinely pushed for reform to maintain the church's spiritual mission. Popes like Gregory VII and Innocent III, even while asserting strong papal authority, also implemented some reforms within the church.
Okay, then we get to the Renaissance. The source paints this picture of Boniface VIII around 1300, like a real high point, global recognition. But then shocks led to decline. What were these shocks?
Yeah, that Jubilee year in 1300 under Boniface VIII, it really did symbolize a peak of prestige. But the shocks that followed were severe. First, the popes moving to Avignon in France, away from Rome, that didn't look good.
Babylonian captivity, they called it.
That's the one. And then, even worse, the Great Schism we mentioned, with multiple claimants to the papal throne. These events just shattered the church's unity and the pope's authority in the eyes of, well, pretty much everyone.
But the Renaissance itself, culturally, that was an amazing time, wasn't it? Even involving the church.
Oh, absolutely. Amidst all the political and religious turmoil, you have this incredible explosion of art, literature, philosophy, much of it patronized by the church and popes themselves. Humanism, with its focus on classical learning and human potential, deeply influenced religious thought, too.
But wasn't there also a lot of corruption tied to the papacy during the Renaissance?
Yes, that's the other side of the coin. The papal court in Rome became known for its immense wealth, political scheming, and sometimes pretty scandalous behavior.
Like the Borgias.
Infamously, yes. And figures like Savonarola in Florence were preaching fiery sermons against this extravagance and moral decay in Rome. And again, those earlier criticisms from people like Wycliffe, they found new ears in this climate of perceived corruption. The whole spectacle of rival popes just added fuel to the fire, eroding trust.
Which perfectly sets the stage for the really big one, the Reformation. How did that just fundamentally change everything for the papacy?
The Reformation was the earthquake. Kicked off by Martin Luther in Germany, 1517, posting his 95 Theses, mostly about the sale of indulgences at first.
Right, paying to get time off purgatory.
Basically, yes.
Yeah.
But Luther's challenge went much deeper. His core idea is justification by faith alone. The idea that anyone could read and interpret the Bible for themselves. These struck right at the heart of the Pope's authority and centuries of Catholic teaching. And thanks to the printing press, those 95 Theses spread like wildfire.
So it just tore up the religious map of Europe and weakened the Pope's grip permanently?
Absolutely. It led to a massive, lasting decline in papal authority and prestige. Whole countries broke away, new Protestant churches formed, Europe was split down the middle religiously, and that had huge political fallout, too.
But the Catholic Church fought back, right? They didn't just let it happen.
No way. They launched the Counter-Reformation. This was a period of serious internal reform, clamping down on abuses, but also a major pushback against Protestantism. The Council of Trent was central to this clarifying Catholic doctrine, reforming seminary training, coordinating efforts to win back areas lost to Protestantism.
Okay, moving into more modern times, the 19th century. The source says the papacy started out weaker then. Why was that?
Well, the French Revolution and the Napoleonic era had really shaken up the old order and stripped the papacy of a lot of its remaining temporal power and land. Plus, you had the rise of liberalism, nationalism ideologies that inherently challenged the Pope's traditional authority. Popes like Pius VII, Gregory VI, they were mostly reacting against these modern trends, really emphasizing the spiritual authority instead.
But then Italy unified, and that must have been a huge blow to the Papal States.
It was. Mid-19th century, Italy becomes one kingdom, and the Pope loses his territories, the Papal States. He's no longer a king in the same way. But kind of paradoxically, losing that worldly kingdom arguably strengthened the Pope's spiritual standing in the eyes of many Catholics.
How so?
Without the baggage of running a country, the papacy could focus entirely on its religious role. And this period culminates in the First Vatican Council declaring papal infallibility.
Papal infallibility, that feels like a huge declaration, especially when their actual land was disappearing.
It was a very bold assertion, yeah. Essentially saying that when the Pope speaks officially, ex cathedra, on faith and morals, he's protected from error by God. So while political power waned, they doubled down on the spiritual claims. It was a major statement, and still a point of discussion, of course. The 19th century also saw challenges from nationalism within countries, internal church debates. And then, of course, the papacy had to navigate the huge upheavals of the 20th century, including 2 world wars.
Which brings us pretty much up to today. What's the papacy's role now? What are the big issues?
Well, today the papacy definitely has a significant diplomatic presence. It engages with countries all over the world, international bodies. There's also a huge focus on interfaith dialogue, trying to build bridges with other religions.
Yeah.
That meeting between Pope Paul VI and Orthodox Patriarch Athenagoras, I was a landmark moment there.
But surely there are people questioning if the papacy is even relevant anymore
Yeah.
in our very secular, diverse world.
Oh, absolutely. That's a constant question. In a world with rising secularism, so many different beliefs, the papacy faces challenges about its relevance, its adaptability, and internally, too, there are complexities interpreting teachings, keeping a huge global church united. The source even talks about the severe hurdles of papalism.
What about things like social justice, human rights? Where does the papacy stand?
That's become a much stronger emphasis, especially since the Second Vatican Council in the 1960s. There's a lot of teaching on social justice, human dignity, drawing on principles like those in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And this idea of interreligious dialogue is seen as essential to the Church's mission now. You also have to remember the papacy's historical role, for better or worse, during colonization and globalization, drawing lines on maps, missionary work, and so on.
It's interesting, too, thinking about the styles of leadership. Different popes, different eras. The source mentions that.
Yeah, it does. You see different phases. Before 1300, maybe periods known for, intellectual brilliance, maybe even some humor. Later, you get popes really focused on moral reform, a more serious tone. Then later still, you see popes who are very politically savvy, alongside others who seem to aim for more spiritual simplicity.
And that Great Schism period, 1378 to 1417, with rival popes, that must have been chaotic leadership.
Utter chaos, a huge challenge to the idea of a single leader, and incredibly damaging. And you also see how the system for choosing popes, the College of Cardinals, has evolved and been reformed over time, often in response to criticisms about the papal administration, the curia getting too powerful or bureaucratic.
So looking ahead, the future of the papacy, what are the big question marks? It seems like it's in a really complex spot.
It really is. The future is definitely up for debate. I mean, it's lost its direct earthly kingdom, but many would argue its moral and intellectual sway is still huge globally. History shows it's faced massive challenges before the Reformation, the French Revolution, and survived, adapted. But it's also shown vulnerability.
It sounds like the source kind of presents two possible paths forward.
Exactly. One view is, well, maybe continued decline in influence as the world gets more secular. The other path sees a potential resurgence, focusing purely on that spiritual authority, those core religious principles. The source talks about this enduring, vast empire of spiritual ideas that has somehow weathered all these historical storms.
Wow. This has been quite a journey through a really complex history. What comes through loud and clear from this source is that the papacy story is one of incredible highs, deep lows, immense power, significant decline, and constant adaptation. Not simple at all.
Not simple at all, but hopefully this overview gives you, the listener, a useful framework, a shortcut maybe, to understanding the long, winding road this institution has traveled.
Absolutely. So thinking about all this history, the current challenges, here's a final thought for you to chew on. What do you see as the most likely future for the papacy? Is there one single factor you think will be most decisive in shaping its influence in the coming decades? Definitely something fascinating to ponder.